We are starting this week's Good News Roundup with something that started really terribly, but I promise it has a bright ending.
Okay,
So let's go back to the 1950s when
let's.
Egypt accidentally gave a bunch of its citizens hepatitis C. Uh,
Hate it when that happens.
yeah. They had a mass vaccination campaign that used unsterilized needles, and they accidentally spread Hep C everywhere. And this whole story I learned about, by the way, in the New York Times, an article by Stephanie Nolan, is an amazing article. So after we summarize it, I do recommend people go and check it out. So what happened after that, oopsie, is that it spread so much in the population that by 2007, 1 in 10 Egyptians had a chronic infection of hepatitis C, which, if you don't know anything about hepatitis C, which I didn't really before I read the article, a chronic infection can lead to pretty severe liver problems like cirrhosis or liver cancer, stuff like that. So, not good. And they just had this like massive chronic problem that they didn't really know what to do with and that the government itself had caused. So in 2013, an American pharma company made an antiviral, which the New York Times calls the first cure for a viral infection in the history of medicine. The antiviral was massively expensive. And I don't know how this happened, and I wish the article had gone into this a little bit further, but maybe they also don't know how this happened. Egypt somehow managed to negotiate a deal for the pill at only $10 a pop. Usually it was $1,000 for its once a day pill. And then they arranged for Indian and Egyptian drug companies to make a cheaper generic version in exchange for a royalty. After 2013, some more companies made similar antivirals for Hep C. Egypt did this massive, screening of the population, massive uptake of the antivirals. Fast forward to now, they've basically wiped it out. There's a 0.4% prevalence in the population, and they're going to help other countries with a high Hep C burden essentially copy what they did. But the article points out that's very unusual. Usually in the global health field, you have high income countries helping out low income countries. But in this case, Egypt is the sort of the leader and the big major player here, which is kind of crazy how it all started, but good to see them cleaning up their mess.
Literally in this case, right? So, yeah, we did have this brief moment, of course, in 2020, 2021, where the attention of the world turned toward these sort of massive technological innovations in the way we develop vaccines and in the ways in which vaccines have been essential to the spread of public health throughout the 20th century. The reality is, and I think this was part of the discussion and why subsidies for the COVID vaccines were necessary, is that vaccines have never been particularly good business for companies. Although
Mm-hmm.
at $1,000 a shot, they're certainly a lot better business. But mass vaccines have tended not to be. There's not as huge a financial incentive for biotech companies and the research companies that support them to develop mass vaccines as opposed to very high end cures, treatments for end of life cancer at, as you said, $1,000 per pill, or $50,000 to $250,000 for a course. And that remains a problem in the way in which we do drug development, drug discovery, and then, of course, the commercialization of cures, because we certainly have the scientific and pharmaceutical capacity to deal with many more diseases than we deal with, but we don't necessarily have the right capital structure to lead to the deployment of those. And some of that, the case you mentioned, is often enabled by governments that say, look, there's a public health necessity for this, so we're going to short circuit or do an end run or close the gap between whatever the free market incentives are and what the public health incentives are. It's interesting to note that since 2021, the leading proponent and developer of the RNA vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, Moderna, which was treated as this darling of both the financial markets and the media, its stock has completely imploded since its high, even though it did exactly what it was going to do. It spent years
Mm.
working on these mRNA vaccines. So you do have this example in the Egypt case of some necessity of public and private. That if it's all public, governments aren't going to develop the R&D and the research and the raw science that leads to vaccine development. But the free market alone is likely either going to price them in a way that doesn't allow them to be widespread or developed in the first place. So the lesson here is somewhat what the lesson was in 2021, that these are kind of the one of the cases, along with infrastructure, where public private really needs to be working in conjunction.
Yeah, and that's that putting aside the extra special case of the US healthcare system, which I talked to a pharmacist friend about this article. She saw our TikTok about it. And she told me that, to your point about the free market not being enough, in the US, still, the price, maybe not that the patient is going to be paying, but the price overall for a full Hep C treatment in the States is $33,000. So it's just massively expensive. And it's really surprising and unusual, as you're pointing out, that Egypt was able to manage this deal because normally that wouldn't happen. And I'm so curious about how that came about. If anyone knows, write us in,
Please,
tell us.
yeah, let us know.